say something about the tree planting. We had a tree planting this past weekend. Henry was in charge of it. Samford had a lot of students. I think it was like between 20 and 40 students. And then we had some Friends of Shades Creek people. And we planted 220 trees, seedlings along the Greenway. It was at the western end, close to where the soccer fields are. So it was a really good day. The students did a great job, and I know Henry was really pleased to get them planted. And our next meeting in December, we'll have the story about the seedlings and what's being expected for more plantings and why and how. What these trees are, they're not just trees from, you know, any nursery. The seeds have come from trees that are in our community that are old growth trees, and the seeds have been collected and carefully have been planted at Birmingham Botanical Gardens, where they've been cared for there by Henry and staff there. And some of them are like 2, 3, 4 years old. So but they're all native seeds. So he'll be talking about that, and Amy Milam and Amber Cuscos will also be talking about their part. Amy has worked with the Homewood Environmental Commission, which has helped with planting, and Amber has helped with the students at Samford. So it should be a great program. You'll learn a lot about the seedlings and why it's important to keep our native forests going. Just a brief message about Brookwood Village is planning to do a remodel. And so we've been attending some of those meetings and keeping in touch with what's going on there. We hope to work with them about getting Shades Creek having a more forested look at Brookwood. But anyway, we'll see what's going on. There's going to be a lot of changes at Brookwood. About the only thing that won't change is Macy's. We'll probably stay about the same, but the other stores and spaces are going to be changed up a lot. So we'll have more information about that as it comes. Right now, it's just in the beginning phases. So I think that's it, except I do want to say happy birthday to Jim Brown. Today is his birthday, and here he is on doing our program for us. So let's give him a round of applause for happy birthday. Happy birthday, Jim. And thank you for joining us on your birthday. And
thank you. Do I share screen?
All right, so we're going to start off with you, Jim. Are you ready?
Can you see me, or is that Google Earth?
That's Google Earth. We can see Google Earth, and then we can see you up in the top.
Okay, that's good enough. Small picture is good enough. I'm Jim Brown, and I'm doing a tag team presentation tonight with Birgit, and I told her my theory of the night was that I would ramble on first, and she could correct any mistakes and fill in any holes I left. I'm not really a local historian. I'm a professional historian, but it's more European and world stuff. So this is, I'm not the caliber scholar of Birgit and Marjorie White and James Lowry, for that matter. But I accidentally happened on this place and want to tell you about Ross Bridge from the point of view of a kind of an early discoverer. We moved to Birmingham in the summer of 1971, and I hadn't been in Alabama 3 times before that. And so I did a lot of exploring. And I was out hiking where the main north-south railroad comes through Birmingham, down south of town. Here, if you can see on Google Earth, here's Homewood, downtown Homewood here. Here's the Bluff Park Bulge of Hoover right here. And here comes Shades Creek, and here is Little Ross Creek coming into it. But I was out hiking up here You know that long stretch of Shannon Oxmoor Road that parallels the railroad, and then the road, right where the road crosses the railroad, there used to be a horse riding business right here. You couldn't walk. It was fenced in. You couldn't walk in there, but along the railroad track itself, and what seemed to be a kind of a secondary railroad, old railroad track beside it, and then the power line right away, there was good blackberry picking, among other things. I don't really know exactly what I was doing out there that day, but I ran into an old timer who was also knocking around the woods and fields and struck up a conversation. And he asked me if I knew about the old Civil War era slave built stone culvert a ways off in the woods. I said I did not, and he offered to hike me out to see it. And being of the age of innocence and immortality, I went with him. And it was a remarkable sight. It was not just a, um, a sort of ordinary culvert, but it was a kind of a hand cut stone work of art. You can see the picture there. I didn't think of it again for decades until around the year 2000 when the city of Homewood began exploring purchase of that long defunct horse farm land for ball fields and such. And I told Michelle, uh, catty corner neighbor of mine, and others in the newly organized Friends of Shades Creek, that there was a truly interesting structure out there, possibly on land that interested Homewood. Um, she was intrigued, especially since Ross Creek is a tributary of Shades Creek, and so she got together a group for me to guide there one Saturday. I remembered the old stone viaduct being maybe a quarter mile down the tracks from the Shannon crossing. And so we walked down the old railroad bed right there, walked down maybe a quarter mile. Sure enough, there was a creek, but no sign of a viaduct, much less anyone with a railroad causeway over it. And the other hikers looked at me a little skeptically and wound up going off exploring on their own. And much puzzled and a little bit embarrassed, I set off down the main tracks. And we'd gone about a quarter mile. And I got on the tracks and I kept going and kept going. Let me take you back before the Ross Bridge subdivision. Let me go. This is the timeline that you go back in aerial photographies in Google Earth. Let me take you back to this is about as far back as they go. This is February of 2003 aerial imagery. So you can still see, here's Bluff Park, and here's Shades Creek coming like so, and here is Ross Creek running into it. And let me frame it so the junction of the two creeks is at the bottom, and Shannon, here's the little town of Shannon right here at the top. So I can get that sort of framed. So here's Shannon, and here is the used to be the old L&N tracks, now the CSX tracks. And I went hiking down this trail another full mile, and then saw this level, uh, long radius curve road leading off, and I took it, and then came to my causeway. Uh, it was a mile down the tracks and another 0.4 miles into the woods, and all I could figure out was that a mile and a half hike, and when I in my mid 20s was the same as a quarter mile in my mid 50s. But I went back. Let me draw a circle around it. Here is a half mile radius circle around that causeway, and the viaduct is what lets Ross Bridge through it there. So I went back and got the group, and I came back and showed them, partly to show them I wasn't crazy. And they were by and large as wowed by the structure as I had been. And then it was Hoover instead of Homewood that actually annexed the property and slated it for development. And I think it was my history department colleague, Marlene Reichert, who longtime resident of Hoover, who told us how to get in touch with the city council about it, just to make sure they knew what they now had. And Michelle for Friends of Shades Creek and Randy Haddock for the Cahaba River Society asked to be allowed to present concerns for such a major development they had scheduled to the Hoover City Council. I wasn't there, but Michelle told me that she spent a lot of her time talking about that old viaduct or culvert, how it would make a wonderful nucleus for maybe a 50-acre park in that new upscale housing development. It would have been a natural point for a whole rails to trails network. And so by this time I had drawn a picture of I had drawn so I can come up with it again. I had drawn a rough two-scale sketch of the whole thing. It was almost 10. It's a perfect Roman arch, 15 courses and drop keystone. It was about 10 feet across the arch and maybe 15 feet from the floor down here. And these enormous blocks, some of these 2 or 3, 2 feet by 3 feet, and curves to fit the radius of the thing. It was just a marvelous. And the date on this picture was August of 2001. Oops, I've lost. Uh-oh. Sorry, Michelle.
Did you lose the picture?
Yeah, I'm losing everything. I can't turn it off.
We can still see Google Earth behind your.
I can't. The pictures aren't there, and I can't turn them off. I'm sorry. Oh, here we go. Oh, let me stop share and start again.
Okay.
Can I try it again? Okay.
Sure.
All right. Oh my, it's not going to let me do it again, I'm afraid. Okay, here we go. That was dangerous. But at any rate, Michelle had brought color photos and that line drawing and showed them all. And since the planners had their easels and maps set up with U.S. Steel real estate and Daniel Corporation's development plans, she told me she was able to show them exactly where the structure was located. And with Michelle's impression, nobody on the Hoover City Council or representing the developers knew the structure was there, much less than it was with this new property acquisition, one of the oldest substantial man-made structures in Hoover. The current head of the council showed considerable interest and asked Michelle if he'd take him out, and Henry Hughes went too, and they hiked in from the Shannon Crossing, that 1.25 miles down the main tracks and over a 1/4 mile in. And as she remembers it, when they finally got there, the councilman was much impressed. And so the Hoover City government responded positively to the idea of preserving it. The Daniel Corporation only did a 2-acre preserved park with a viaduct at its center. Sadly, from our point of view, not as much as it could have been. And after all, for the Real Estate Development Corporation, it went a long way toward turning a proximity to a very busy and noisy railroad track from a negative in terms of residential development to a positive. The main sales office in the development for the first 10 or so years actually had a railroad theme inside. It still looks like an old-fashioned railroad terminal from the outside. At that first meeting of the council, the developers were calling it Shannon Valley Development. And some of the developers asked Michelle and later me if we knew any Indian names associated with the property, and all we knew was the name of the Ross family. And so at the very next council meeting, the developers made revised presentations, and all of a sudden the name was Ross Bridge. And as of this writing, the Ross Bridge Development website, anchored by a beautiful color picture of the viaduct and the deep pool, still opens with a couple pages of text about the old viaduct, including this paragraph. Beyond its uncontested role as one of Birmingham's beloved historic landmarks, the impact of the bridge at Ross Creek is quite clear, as it was the inspiration behind our distinct community here at Ross Bridge, ! We think you'll agree, there's no question that Ross Bridge offers home buyers an opportunity to live and da-da-da-da. Well, for starters, inspiration behind our distinct community seems to reverse the historical causality. And of course, it's not a bridge at all. It's a culvert or a viaduct. I'm guessing culvert was a less upscale word than bridge in the eyes of developers. But at least between the city of Hoover and the development corporations, the beautiful stone culvert and the causeway over it are preserved and celebrated. About this time, some industrial historians specializing in Alabama were invited in to take a look at the arched culvert. They were of the general opinion that such a sophisticated and obviously expensive structure could not have been built with money from the South, especially in the Civil War. It had to have been the product of new Northern money that flooded in years later. After all, the railroad coming up from Selma hadn't made it north over Brock's Gap and Shades Mountain until 1871, 6 full years after the Civil War ended. Why would you need a causeway and a culvert before then? Well, I was sort of disappointed to think my old timer might have been so mistaken, but I didn't have the interest in or the knowledge of how to dig into local history enough to prove those claims right or wrong. It wasn't until 2017, about 45 years after I saw the culvert, that and 15 years after I'd first hiked the Friends of Shades Creek folks out there to see it, that things happened all in a rush to bring it into focus. And it centered on Marjorie White of the Birmingham Historical Society. In or about late 2015, she began assembling a team to work on the history of Shades Creek and the communities that had grown up along it and its tributaries, which of course included Ross Creek. I only knew of Marjorie and her local history work in a vague sort of way. I first met her back in the mid 70s when she had attended a summer kind of experimental summer history seminar 4 of us in the department offered, called New Horizons in History. She had come to a couple of those sessions. Although I had met her and knew hazily about her heading up the Birmingham Historical Society, I didn't have that much interest in local history and much more interested in local folklore and natural history. Um, but as I remember it, sometime in the fall or winter of 2016, mutual friends directed Marjorie to me about that historic structure at the heart of the 10-year-old Ross Bridge community. Um, let me let me zoom out, and this is a 2003 aerial photography. Let me turn that off and come up to the present. And I'll tell you what I can do even better. I can show you the. Let me go back to 2003. So here's 2003. You know, watch when we come up to. Here's 2003 still. 2005. Now watch the jump to 2006. 9 months time, bang! You get this whole development going in big time. Um, but mutual friends directed Marjorie to me about this structure. I think maybe because I've been a little proprietorial about its discovery. And Marjorie and I arranged to meet out there and explore. A much easier exploration than it used to be, because the new Ross Bridge Parkway runs within a long stone's throw of the culvert today. On the day, Marjorie brought this the first time I met Birgit Kibelka. She brought Birgit with her, a landscape architect, though I didn't really know where Birgit fit in the picture at that time. Remarkably, almost unaccountably, Marjorie had never seen this fascinating structure, despite the fact she had led history efforts locally over 40 years, had been all over Jefferson and surrounding counties like a herd of sheep. And she and Birgit were as enchanted by their first sight of it as I'd been, and very much intrigued by the local lore that said it was Civil War and slave built. What happened next, from my point of view, was that I was invited by Marjorie to participate in a February 20th, 2017 cleaning and documentation day for Ross Creek Culvert. The basic idea was to start by getting rid of the vegetation sprouting from the cracks in the structure so it could be properly photographed and measured. Since the water in the pool at the downstream end was deeper than head high, some sort of stable flotation was needed for cleaners and measurers. I threw my 2 canoes on the ladder rack of the old pickup truck and drug them down to the water, lashed a hickory walking stick across the middle thwarts of the 2 canoes, and tied the bows and stern together to make a fairly stable platform. Brought waders for sloshing around the shallows in the upstream end and down through the 62-foot long tunnel of the culvert. We were a crew of 8, tearing vines and oak leaf hydrangea sprouts off the surface of it, measuring and such. The day was sunny and got quite warm for February, and after a while it all started to feel like real work. I asked Marjorie what the going rate for manual labor was for such historical enterprises, and she shot back that according to her records to date, it was something less than a penny a day a person for the contracted slave labor that built it in the first place. I told her that I hoped the paymaster would at least round off. On the documentation team that day was photographer Jet Lowe, who made this Library of Congress picture. He used what looked to me like a Matthew Brady rig from the Civil War, setting up a big box camera on a tripod and throwing its attached black cloth over his head when looking through the viewfinder. And there, as chief of measuring, was Richard Anderson. Marjorie told me Richard was somewhat frail, suffering from some illness, though I didn't know on the day just how serious he was. There was Birgit, the landscape architecture I met earlier, who also turned out to have canoeing skills. Katie Tipton, later identified to me as a great editor, was there on this day as a champion puller of weeds and measuring tapes. Carol Slaughter, geologist, was there to try to identify the stone used. Betty Anderson helped out too on this 8-person team. Then I went home and generally forgot about it again. Less than 2 months later, 4:45 in the afternoon of April 10, 2017, according to notes taken on my iPhone, I was once again knocking around the thickets and fields on the old railroad bed south of the Shannon Crossing. And up the gravel trail came a four-wheeler, and the rider turned the motor off to talk. He was William Preston, he said, born in 1961, raised in Shannon. He had actually worked at the local horse riding business as a teenager and thought it closed about 1980. And did he know about the old stone culvert at Ross Creek under the railroad causeway? Of course, he said. The deep hole at the downstream end was once the local summertime swimming hole for the whole Shannon community. There was even a rough road down through the piney woods next to it. He could remember a picture in his grandmother's house of a 1965 pickup truck parked next to the swimming hole. The adults called it Arched Culvert. The kids all just called it Archie Culvert, William told me. So much for my self-image as the last surviving human who knew about the old stone culvert and brought it to everybody's attention. Apparently everybody who grew up in Shannon still knew about it too. And 2 months after that, Marjorie gave me a copy of the newest Birmingham Historical Society newsletter for June 2017, 12 dense pages entirely devoted to explaining the history of Ross Creek Culvert. I'm but a so-so local historian, more interested in impressionistic scenes, patterns of memory than digging out the essential facts. But now I was blown away by the report's specificity on how this structure came to be, how Marjorie's team and their collective researches had essentially rewritten the foundational history of Birmingham. In early 2019, she presented her team's new book, the book on Shades Creek flowing through time. I'm sure most members of Friends of Shades Creek will remember fondly, in a series of talks. And the first day the book was on sale at Homewood's yearly Salamander Festival, the last Saturday in January. I bought the book and got her to sign it. Beautiful work, full of full color photos and wonderful maps. But I was surprised only a couple of pages were devoted to Ross Creek Culvert. And it seemed to me that whole story ought to be told too. So I got permission to interview Marjorie in March a year ago, and got her some of her life story and how she got in this to begin with. But I'm pushing my 20 minutes that I promised I wouldn't cross the line over. So I'll turn it over from this point to Birgit to fill in holes and correct mistakes.
Well, I certainly don't want to to correct anything. Jim, thanks so much for this overview of the recent history of the Ross Creek Culvert. I really especially like the live presentation of zooming in on the map. I thought that was very helpful to understand the location of it. And now I have to try and share my screen. Just give me a minute. Okay, can you see the screen now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. So what I want to do is I want to give you an overview of I confused myself just now. I'm sorry. Just one moment. So what I want to talk to you about after this overview of the recent history of the Ross Creek Culvert is its origin and its historical context. And I will also take a closer look at the structure itself, what Jim might not have shown us yet. The Ross Creek Stone Culvert was built in the Shades Valley as part of the South and North Alabama Railway. The line was chartered in 1854 by the Alabama legislature and was often referred to as the Great Central Railroad or Alabama Central Railroad. It was to connect the Alabama capital at Montgomery across very hilly terrain to the Tennessee River to open the state's mineral regions for development. The major promoter and investor in this railroad was Frank Gilmer. 4 years after the initial charter of the line in 1858, engineer John T. Milner was selected by the Alabama governor to survey the routes for the railroad to develop the state's mineral resources. Milner reported back that same year and suggested a route that would connect Montgomery to the Tennessee River in Decatur via Wetumpka, Montebello, and Blount Springs. His recommendations for the best route were officially adopted by the Alabama legislature in 1860. A loan of over $660,000 was granted and a 5-year timeline established to grade and prepare the railroad for iron. However, obviously conditions changed dramatically in 1861 when Alabama seceded from the Union and Montgomery became the capital of the Confederacy. The state immediately passed legislation creating a firm to provide armament to defend the state. Frank Gilmer and John T. Milner were principals. Their Alabama arms manufacturing company, however, failed to raise sufficient capital. But in November of 1862, the same principals restructured the firm as Red Mountain Iron and Coal Company. The company was tasked with opening coal and ore mines, a furnace to manufacture iron, and with building a railroad to carry the iron to the arsenals at Selma and to Rome in Georgia. With Confederate government financing, the Red Mountain Iron and Coal Company acquired 7,340 acres in the wilderness area of Shades Valley, and that was at the end of 1892, in order to build furnaces and to open mines. And obviously that's that same area that Jim had been pointing to on his overview of what later on became the Ross Bridge area. And also between May 1861 and November 1862, the South and North Alabama Railroad purchased strategic lands to permit the railroad to cross Shades Mountain and to reach Red Mountain. As part of these land purchases for the South and North, John T. Milner acquired the 490 acres in and about Ross Creek from farmer James Taylor Ross in November 1862. The creek, Culvert, and the entire community of Ross Bridge would be named after James Taylor Ross only 140 years later, as Jim just told us. The Oxmoor furnace was built on the acquired land and blown in 1863. It was Jefferson County's first iron producing furnace. By late 1862, John T. Milner had extended his railroad up to Montgomery, from Montgomery to Calera, and had reached the southern slope of Shades Mountain. Confident that the railroad would cross Shades Mountain, railroad engineers John T. Milner and Richard Hamlin Kelly designed and supervised construction of the Ross Creek Culvert in late 1863 or early 1864. But while the railroad was able to work its way up the southern slopes of Shades Mountain, the connection through the rock at Brock's Gap was not built due to lack of explosives due to the war. Beyond the gap within the Shades Valley, the railroad was graded, but tracks were not laid. During 1864 and 1865, carts heavily laden with iron crossed the culvert and headed to the railhead on the south side of Shades Mountain, and on from there by train to the Selma Arsenal, where 900 men made the iron into shot and shell. And here's the map that shows the location of the railroad that ended just on the south side of what is today's, of Brock's Gap. The location of the culvert would have been here where the red dot is, and the coal mines obviously on the south side of Shades Mountain, while the newly opened ore mine on Red Mountain, and the Oxmoor furnaces up here. After the war, nitroglycerin and funding were found. Oh, and I forgot something very important right now. What happened in between, of course, was just before the end of the war in March 1865, the Union cavalry, the Wilson's Raiders, set fire to wood structures and wrecked Confederate iron-making machinery at the Oxmoor, Irondale, and Tannehill furnace. Urban legend has it that the Ross Bridge culvert was also damaged during the raid, but we believe that the missing stones at the corner of the culvert are actually water damage. So after the war, explosive, so to speak, nitroglycerin and funding were found to complete the railway through the mountain. It took another 6 years until the passage to the gap and the railroad were completed. Work on the railroad portion between Calera and Elton resumed in 1869. The final part of the 2,000 feet long and sometimes 75-foot deep channel through the mountain at Brock's Gap was blasted in 1871. In November of the same year, the first train ran on this line through Brock's Gap and across the Ross Creek Culvert. Its crossing with the Alabama and Chattanooga Railroad established the city of Birmingham as the center of the mineral region. Founded December 19, 1871 by the Elton Land Company, Birmingham became the South's largest industrial center. A year later, the Louisville and Nashville Railroad acquired the railway and completed the line northward to Decatur and the Tennessee River. And if you think back, they had, the charter happened in 1854, so it really took a very long time to accomplish this. The line transported minerals, iron pipe, and foundry products, as well as passengers. It ran across the culvert until 1908, when a double-tracked main line was built for the L&N. And for the next 20 years, the railway across the culvert served as a spur track to the Oxmoor furnaces that had been rebuilt in 1873 and was operated by US Steel from 1907 to 1927. The railway and the Ross Creek Culvert then slipped back into obscurity until the recent suburban development that, as Jim just showed us before. And so I'm showing you this slide of the wilderness once more. And as you just heard, the history of the railway was somewhat turbulent, but I haven't showed you a whole lot about the culvert itself, or how it was crafted, or by whom it was crafted. The structure, as we can see, was carefully conceived and built and is tested multiple times by Jim Brown. We know that every new visitor is surprised and in awe of this elaborate remnant of a different time. Today, the culvert appears disconnected and somewhat astray in its surroundings, as there are no more rails or furnaces to tell the story of why it was needed. And here you can see the location again, the historic causeway, and the location of the culvert itself that you can actually see when you're driving by on Rossbridge Parkway. And the Hoover Historical Society has put up a historical marker right here across from the culvert, so that that's really a good marker so that you know where to look to see the culvert right from the street. And as you can also see here, the culvert is well connected to the rest of the neighborhood by a trail, the Rossbridge Trail, that leads to the entire community. This is the view along the causeway as it crosses the culvert below. The forest has reclaimed the embankment, and an asphalt walkway was installed that is the center part of a figure 8 walking trail around the park. The Ross Bridge evidently was built in a remote location in 1863 or 64, and it is only today, with the development of the Rossbridge community and the construction of the Rossbridge Parkway, that it is readily accessible. Its creators, more than 150 years ago, were well aware that this substantial structure would be built in a remote location. They made sure that it would be high quality construction that would last for a long time without requiring much maintenance. The structure is a culvert and not a bridge, even though both terms are being used interchangeably, as Jim also noted. But a culvert is a tunnel structure that is totally enclosed by soil, which is evidently what we have here. And the tunnel is actually called a vault. And at the Rossbridge Culvert, it is 62 feet long and is made of voussoirs, which are the stones cut at an angle to form the arch. It features a keystone at the top of the arch at both ends, and the vault starts at the spring line above several rows of ashlar masonry. The stone is Pennsylvanian era shade sandstone, and also stones except the inside of the arch are dressed with a margin draft, which is a recess around its edge. You can see here a little bit. I think actually on Jim's drawing, you could see that, that recess a little bit better than on this photo. The stone appears to be laid dry, meaning without using mortar. This was typical for similar 18th and 19th century structures. And you may imagine that it required extremely exact work on each stone to ensure that they matched perfectly when laid on top of each other. The advantage of a dry laid structure is that water can drain from behind the walls, thus avoiding built-up pressure, and no maintenance for mortar joints was needed. The ends of the vault are flanked by circular wing walls, stepped to follow the angle of repose in the railroad embankment. And interestingly, the typical straight-face wall or spandrel was not built here. Instead, curved walls extend directly from the end of the vault. Just you can see that here, that really just as the vault ends, the curve starts, and so the overall impression is of a entirely circular wall. Behind the stone walls and above the vault lies rubble covered with embankment soil. This is typical for this kind of construction. The rubble is visible in two locations where stones have fallen out. And that would be here in this corner, and we can zoom in. You see that much better here. And on the opposite side of the structure, there's another corner where you can see the rubble. And these areas show us that Ross Creek Culvert has deteriorated over time by some measure. The south side of vault and wing have settled several inches. As you can see when you're looking at the water table here, you see the little ledge at the bottom of the wall, and it's not visible on the south side of the vault where it would be under the water line actually. So that's where the settling occurred. Many skills were needed to build such a detailed and complex structure. James Gage, an authority on stone structures in the northeastern US, states that the stones were cut, shaped, and finished by skilled artisans. The assembly of the culvert would have been overseen by a master stonemason. Carpenters would have been needed to construct the support framework to hold the arch in place during placement of the stones. Laborers would have been needed for transporting, hoisting, and positioning the stones. And to show you what this would have looked like, we have this photo of the construction of a stone culvert in the same time period. Looking at the photo and at the size of the men, you can see that the structure is substantially larger than the Ross Creek culvert. But the process is the same. Culvert floor and abutments are built, as are the wing walls up to the spring line before the centering. The wooden framework supporting the voussoirs during construction is installed. Derricks, similar to the ones that you see here, may have been used to lift the large stones into place. The engineer involved with the design of the bridges and culverts for the South and North Railroad was most likely Richard Hamlin Kelly. An Irish-born and educated railroad engineer, Kelly moved to Alabama from Iowa shortly before the Civil War to work on the South and North Railroad. His descendants claim that he designed the 1856 Rock Island Railroad Bridge in Davenport, Iowa, which was the first railroad bridge spanning the Mississippi River. Records of the actual construction of the bridge and the people involved are far and few between. Correspondence, invoices, material order slips, and photos made during the years of the Civil War have not been located. We did find newspaper advertisements for workers needed between 1862 and 1864 to build the South and North Railroad. And this is one of these advertisements. It calls for bridging, track laying, grading and getting ties and timbers. And applicants were to report to Richard Hamlin Kelly in Lime Station, which is now Calera in Shelby County. And so this advertisement also shows us that the local lore Jim found out about, that it was a slave-built culvert is very likely to be true, since that's what they were looking for when they were hiring laborers to actually build the culvert. The materials for the culvert, according to Robert Curran, the sandstone needed for it originated at the Culvert quarry on the north slope of Shades Mountain. And on this aerial view, that would be down here. Robert Curran is a great-grandson of Peter Curran, who operated the Culvert quarry after the Civil War. The same quarry is said to have supplied the stone for the construction of the 1863 Oxmoor furnace. And the Culvert Curran family passed down stories through many generations, telling the story of sandstone blocks hauled from the Culvert quarry on the north slope of Shades Mountain through a ford in Shades Creek to the construction site of the Ross Creek Culvert, about 2 miles away, which obviously would have been here. And then you can see how much that another 4 miles away, the Oxmoor furnaces would be built with that same stone. And what hauling these stone blocks this far may have looked like back then, you can see here on these photos. The upper one is from a quarry in Massachusetts, and while the lower one shows the Piney Woods Express, which, according to Ethel Arms, hauled timber for charcoal before the Civil War. The Culvert Curran quarry can still be found today along Shades Crest Road by looking for the sandstone blocks that have the distinct markings of the plug and feather method to split the rock. And those markings you can see right here. They're very visible if you, when you find the site and look for these blocks. It was very astonishing when we visited the site to see that all of this is still there. And this undeveloped land descends from Shades Crest Road down to Shades Creek. Before we come to the question portion of the presentation, I wanted to give an outlook of what is next for Brock's Gap and for the Ross Creek Culvert. Brock's Gap seems to be slated to become an important point of connection once again. This time for a road, the Western Corridor in Hoover, that will alleviate traffic on South Shades Crest Road. The general idea is outlined in this, on this plan, and that's part of the amendment to the city's comprehensive plan that is currently in the works. With careful evaluation and planning, the historic portions of the gap should be preserved and may become accessible as part of a greenway. The Birmingham Historical Society has presented the findings about the historic Ross Creek Culvert at several occasions by now, and the Hoover Historical Society has been very interested, and Hoover Mayor Frank Brocado has created a committee in the administration that is looking at maintenance and repair of the structure in the future. The activity in this new committee is in its beginnings and makes us hopeful that the historic culvert will still be there after another 150 years. Thanks to Jim Brown and many others, this rare and beautiful remnant of Civil War era railroad construction still exists today. Jim's story reminds us that we need to know our cultural heritage if we want to protect and preserve it for future generations. And with that, I would like to open this up for questions.
If anyone wants to ask a question directly, you can, or you can write in the chat window.
Birgit, this is
But
Jim
one at a time, please.
Okay.
Thank-
I just wanted to ask about the impact of the new housing development that's going to come to the north, to the border of Ross Bridge down to 150, which I assume it probably encompasses that small culvert that you have on the map, right? Is that true?
Let's see.
That box culvert.
Yeah.
Do you mean the one that's planned right now, the Deer Valley development, or how they call it? I'm not quite
Well,
sure.
I don't know what there is a.
Let's see. Do you mean the one that will be up here?
Yeah, it's going to be. Yeah, I guess that's. I don't know what they're calling it, but yeah.
Yeah, I know. I've seen it in the Hoover Sun that they were discussing it. I don't know much about it. I think the small box culvert would be here. So it's on the other side of the tracks. So I don't think that this development would impact it, but I don't know what they are planning in this part of the property that's still undeveloped. I don't know if there are any plans for it. That's a good question.
Good.
Birgit,
Mm-hmm.
let me make sure I heard something correctly. So it's, if I remember what you were saying about when the culvert was built, that it was built, but they didn't have the railroad there yet because of Brock's Gap, but they carried the iron by oxen down to meet the railroad. So was the culvert already built and the oxen traffic was over the culvert on the future railroad roadbed?
Right.
Right, exactly. That's what we think happened, and that's also what those stories that were passed down by the current family kind of tell the same story. So it's and I think that would probably be a good question for Marjorie. I think she's on this call. She would
Yes.
know more of the details of that.
That would make sense because oftentimes they went ahead and did the roadbed, sometimes to go ahead and get ownership firmed up and their route firmed up. So it would make sense they go ahead and put in that structure even if they didn't have tracks to lay yet.
Yeah, I mean, I find it surprising when I look at the location of Oxmoor Furnaces and the location of Brock's Gap and think of oxen hauling all this iron from the furnace to that railhead past Brock's Gap. That's a long way. That's 6 miles or even a little bit more than that. So that I'm wondering if that's really true, that there were no rails laid at the time.
It would be very possible
Mm-hmm.
that they would use the oxen for that distance because they did the same thing when they built the pumping station, the existing pumping station on the Cava River. The closest railroad was in English Village, what became English Village, Birmingham Mineral Railroad. And they carried all of the equipment, all of the pumps, everything by oxen, pulled wooden carts all the way to the Cava River where the pumping station is now, which is about 6 miles. And sometimes the path was no wider than a cow path. And they were going over the mountain and ridges to get that material down there. So it's quite an undertaking, but that was the closest railroad at that time to the pumping station. So yeah, they did a lot of oxen hauling back then.
Marjorie, would you like to say something? And please unmute so that we can hear you. There we go.
First, I want to thank you all immensely for your support of this structure over many years and for going out there and following Jim into the wilderness. He really didn't describe what he put you all through back then. And for going to Hoover and to sticking up for it and helping bring them around. I will say the story from U.S. Steel Development is they knew it was there, but they had a tremendous liability with the active railroad running through there, and they were not interested in the culvert because they didn't want anybody down in that vicinity because of the active railroad. So that's their side of the story. However, your side of the story is pretty convincing that you helped move them in terms of naming the structure. I'd also like to thank Jim for enthusiastically getting us back out there to document the structure. And in addition to these interesting tales and things that have been shared with you this evening, if you go to the Library of Congress, Birgit can tell you the number. If you just plug in HARE, AL, you will find the Ross Creek Culvert in photos and the documentation at the Library of Congress, and you can access it online. Birgit, do you know what the number is?
Yes, it's HARE, so HAREAL-214.
Yeah, if you just plug that into your iPhone, you will come up with the documentation at the Library of Congress.
Oh.
And I mean, which is pretty neat. So it was professionally documented by the Historic American Engineering Record, and that information is online at the Library of Congress for worldwide access. And so I thank you all. And I particularly thank Jim for his enthusiasm in helping us get out there to document it. Now,
I have a complaint. I never got my penny for most of a day's work back in
you got a
2017.
free lunch. You got a free lunch and you got a hair report and you got a big history mystery solved because every historian was on record saying that gosh darn thing couldn't have been built. Because why would anybody build it out in the wilderness when they couldn't get their railroad through the mountain because they didn't have any dynamite? Now, as to whether any rails were not laid because rails were in very short supply during the Civil War. And the existing rails were being moved around as they needed them in the state of Alabama and elsewhere to move troops. So no rails were laid because they didn't have that, they didn't have the steel to do so at that point in time. And I guess the other thing that's, I guess, should be mentioned is why did they have to build this thing? It's so swampy there, where actually 3 creeks come off of all the hills going down to, with the branches of Ross Creek that flow into the Cahaba. So it was a really muddy, messy point to get through if they did not have a structure. And if they didn't have one so well built out in the middle of nowhere so that they wouldn't have to go repair it was the idea. But it was an extraordinary team that put it together out there, and it's just, it needs help though at this point in time. I mean, Birgit didn't point that out too much. I hope the Hoover folks are going to get, that the mayor's task force will actually move to get some work done on it because it does need help at this point in time. So I don't have any comments other than Jim Brown, thank you for a wonderful research project, and we hope a great contribution to moving it along. And I guess the most interesting thing out there right now is the opportunity to do something with Brock's Gap. And Birgit, I guess your map suggests that they actually could incorporate a rail trail somehow extending into this area. And the other thing is, Jim Langley, if they are building another development near here, the rail bed that goes over the causeway, you know, when we were out there, we wondered why people kept running in and never coming out, because they were running all the way down the rail bed. And so I hope that they will continue to incorporate that rail bed in whatever development happens down there. And your vision of a 50-acre park may be moving along more to fruition if that rail bed is continued. And certainly the neighbors are out there running on it all the time. So I hope that'll be part of that development if it moves forward.
Marjorie, I have a question for you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I remember way back when Jim introduced me to Chris Doss, who has a lot of historical records, and and we were telling him about this culvert, and he said he thought it was probably the oldest structure in Jefferson County, I think is what he said. Do you think that's true?
No.
Okay.
I mean, it's 1863.
Okay. Yeah.
I mean, we have structures before that.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a house in the city of Birmingham out in the Springville area that's probably 1816. You know, Arlington dates.
Yeah. Arlington's.
I mean,
yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we have structures from the antebellum period. Not that many, but you know, we do.
And it's possible. Maybe he said in the Hoover area. I'm not sure. I thought he said in the county, but maybe in the Hoover area is what he meant. You remember, Jim?
No, can't recall. Sorry.
Well, I think that Hoover's got some really old sites because they were much closer to where things were down in Shelby County. I mean, there was much more development to the south, and Hoover being on that side of Shades Mountain has a lot older sites than
Okay.
over that mountain.
That clears it up. Thank you.
Okay. No, it's certainly one of the most substantial sites anywhere. I mean, impressive sites.
Does anybody else have questions for Marjorie or Jim or Birgit?
Just a thank you to Marjorie for taking this on, grabbing onto it, going with it, and documenting this. This was wonderful. This
Amen.
is an aside for the book that we were very grateful to you for. Thank you very much for doing it.
It was a great project. It still has a good future. Thanks to you all.
Speaking of Marjorie, one of the ironies of this whole thing is that she jumped into this and she was able to document it so fast because of her connections with HAER and the other National Park Service agencies that keep their records in the Library of Congress. But she was working on the Shades Creek book, and she said we had no intention of getting lost on the Ross Bridge, but it turned out that Richard Anderson, who had stayed at her house every time he came to document things in the whole industrial history of Birmingham, he was terminally ill with cancer, and a friend of his had asked Marjorie and Birgit if they could come up with one last good, interesting project for him. And of course, they had just visited the viaduct, and so there it was. He passed away just a few months after the measuring visit, and they actually rescued his computer drawings, the CAD drawings on his computer after he passed away. But the irony is, Marjorie was not going to get sucked into this, but she wound up doing it and rewriting the basic history of Birmingham.
Well, it was a real interesting history mystery. I had no clue how it was going to work out until we found that report. I mean, that documentation that Birgit showed you about how they built these things and why they built them in the wilderness, you know, which cleared it all up. That they didn't want to have to go out there and repair them, so they built them really well.
That is also what I'm finding with all the Birmingham Mineral Railroad culverts. We've found several, over 100 of them, and every one of them still carrying water, still doing their work. And not one of them is damaged. they're all still doing it because they had the same thing with those box culverts. They had to build them and walk away from them and not have to maintain them at all.
Well, they had just, I mean, the railroad had some of the finest quality engineers working for them. You know, that was, as we found, there were Irish craftsmen who, Irish trained engineers who were supervising it, and they understood how to work. I mean, most everything that you found, James, is stone, right?
Yes.
Yes, yeah. They just understood the stone construction. They understood railroad construction, and they were building for eternity.
They did use pipes. They could use a pipe up to 36 inches. There's one of those out in Ruffner Mountain. But beyond 36 inches, to handle more water, they had to use a box culvert. Cut stone, same kind of stones, box culverts, and those are still there today.
A cast iron pipe?
They use cast iron pipes and steel pipes too, mostly cast iron or terracotta pipes. We found terracotta pipes also, but they could go up to, they had to calculate the drainage area, just like the Ross Creek culvert would have done. They had to calculate the drainage area that the culvert needed to handle and then build the culvert the size to take care of that water. And so they could, if they could handle the drainage area with a pipe up to 36 inches, they would use a pipe because all they had to do was lay that down and they were good to go. But then beyond 36 inches, if it required more drainage, more water going through it, they had to build a box culvert. Of course, they had to also quarry all that, haul it in, just like with Ross Bridge. They had to haul it all in from local quarries or had to create quarries where there was stone. But those things are beautiful. None of them have any obstructions inside them. They built them so that the water was turbulent as it went through and have no obstructions that are blocking them at all. After 150 years of use, still working.
Well, I read Milner's 1858 report, and they didn't want to have to build those culverts because that's what made building the railroad very, very expensive.
True, yeah.
And this was a very, very expensive railroad to build because it was going across difficult and changing topography. And, you know, that's one of the reasons it didn't get built early on because they didn't have all the funds. We found another HARE report, Historic American Engineering Record report, for the B&O Railroad up in Pennsylvania. And they just had massive funding pouring into this thing. But that wasn't exactly what you had down here. But the particularly after the Civil War, which is why the South and North sold out to the L&N, because the L&N came in with the money to finish this very expensive railroad. But sorry, I lost my train of thought. Oh, why did they build it? These were Southern investors who had made their money in cotton and headquartered in Montgomery, who had built these incredible fortunes, who were absolutely cocksure that they were going to get their railroad through that mountain and develop this industrial, new industrial place. They had 7,000 acres of land, and at that time, also plenty of money from the Confederate government. And that's another thing that they say. They say about Birmingham that all the money came from the North. Well, in this instance, the money came from the cotton manufacturer of cotton, who were very forward-looking people who wanted to invest in industry. So that's why they built the culvert. They were sure their railroad was going to get there. It just took a little longer than they thought.
Oh, very interesting. There's even more stories that go along with this, it sounds like.
Oh, they're real stories. I mean, the financing of it by Gilmer was his life passion. And, you know, I mean, the end of the thing is, yes, they finally got their railroad. Do you want to hear the end? They got their railroad in, but Milner double crossed the folks who lived in Ealaton who thought the railroad was going to cross there. So you know that there's still stories in families that Milner double crossed them and didn't cross the railroad at Ealaton, but moved it to the site of Birmingham. That is still told that Milner double crossed them and was out. But Gilmer, who had poured all his money into this venture, who was this big cotton planter, was absolutely broken and died a pauper. The L&N came in to bail out the railroad and complete it on up to Decatur, and Milner was out. And the reason he had moved the crossing was that the Yankees, who owned the line through the valley, the east-west line, that was called the Alabama and Chattanooga Railroad. They wanted to divert all the mineral resources from Birmingham by diverting it all up to Chattanooga. And so Milner moved the line to keep the crossing and in the state of Alabama, as had been his dream to complete this railroad. But when he did so, he then was out, and he goes into convict coal mining up in north of the city at Lewisburg, and that's where he lives out his days. He's out of the railroad. The L&N comes in, and they make a great success of it, and the L&N makes a fortune on it, transporting all the mineral resources. But Milner and Gilmer were out. But anyways, Milner did okay in regrouping with his coal mining. So.
Very interesting. Do we have any other questions out there for Jim or Birgit or Marjorie?
Hey, this is Gene Fuller. Can y'all hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, I'm live in Hoover and involved with the Hoover Historical Society, and I'm also an Auburn aerospace engineering person. And I found the presentation very, very interesting. My question has to do with the water flow through the culvert and just what is the drainage area that culvert is serving, and has that changed any in particular because of the development that's going on in and around that area? Does anybody have any comments or knowledge about that?
Birgit, you want to?
Yeah, I think the area that's being drained through the culvert hasn't changed, but there is the lake now at Ross Bridge at that golf course to the left, right across from the tracks. So I don't really know if that makes a huge difference. You would think it would kind of keep the creek from overflowing as much, but yeah, those recent storms, I think was the last one in January maybe, there's a lot of flooding still going on, and I don't know if that has increased or if it's the same as it has always been. I don't really have any comparison for that.
Well, it appears to me that the condition of the culvert has survived, 150 plus years, and it would appear to me that like the water flow has not done very much damage, to it over that period of time. But that, and I just wondered if that's changed any, or in particular with the development. And
Gene, when you wade through that culvert, you can tell it used to be floored, smooth stone flooring, but some of those have gotten turned up at angles, or blocks or logs have washed in. And we think the whole corner that's gone at the downstream end was taken out by water erosion over the years. But I remember when they were just doing the development of Ross Bridge back in 2006, 2005, they did so much of it at one time that the silt fences were overwhelmed. I remember that whoever was building it, they had strung a silt fence across Ross Creek. Of course, the water just pushed it down. But it was, you talk about a plume of silt going into the Gahava for a year, right there at the base of Shades Mountain, because they were developing so much at once and hadn't done enough to protect the runoff. But I
They
think
also,
today
they
it's probably
also
like it.
put in a sewer line right beside, paralleling the creek, right beside the creek and underneath the dirt part of the culvert. And so during that time, they actually built a road across the creek. They piled up riprap and stone and actually in the creek and across the creek during the time of putting in that sewer line. But two major things that happened at that spot after the, years after the culvert was built that may have had an effect on the water flow was the active railroad tracks that are through there now paralleling the old road bed. So those definitely would have had some kind of effect on the creek and the water runoff there. The other one was the more recent Ross Bridge Parkway that goes on the other side of it. And so the building of that had to have had some kind of effect on the drainage patterns and the water, groundwater in that area. So those two on either side of it definitely through the past years must have had some kind of effect. Whether it's good or bad, don't know, but they did have some kind of effect on the drainage.
Can
Gene?
you actually, when you're at that site, can you actually tell the water's flowing?
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Gene, if you go out there, it's an easy walk. But if you go to the culvert, which is kind of the center of that little historical park, and you walk 100 yards up Ross Creek, you
Yeah.
come to the culvert under the new 1907 railroad since 1907. And it's a concrete culvert, just a kind of a huge semicircular concrete culvert. It probably carries about as much water as the old Ross Bridge, Ross Creek culvert, but it's just inelegant. What can I say? You ought to walk if you're interested in that sort of thing. You ought to walk and compare those two.
I've been meaning to. I'm actually live pretty close to it, and I've been meaning to get by there, and this program is incentivized me to make a definite trip there.
It's still free admission.
That's
Well,
good.
on behalf of the Hoover Historical Society, I really appreciate all the work everyone has done. And you can be certain that we are keeping our eye on the bridge and improvements there in Brock's Gap, which both are in Hoover. So.
Good. Thank you.
We do. Thank you very much.
That's the new culvert, 1907, when the L&N double tracked the line. Clearly the older technology was lost.
But 150 years from now, people think, wow, that's a beautiful culvert right there.
Hopefully not.
I mean, that's the main line of the CSX. It's really got, and it's got a lot of traffic. Every time we were there, it was very, very, very busy. So I don't think they'll be out admiring it too closely.
All right.
Just an aside, that active tracks used to have, coming off of the Shannon Road up there, used to have a driveway on the roadbed beside the active tracks. And you would see the crew vans using that roadbed to drive down the tracks near where the Ross Culvert is, because they were having to do crew changes. So the crews can only be driving the trains a certain number of hours, and then another crew has to take over. So for some of the freight trains, those hours ended out at this area. And so they had to bring crews from Irondale out there to swap out crews at the Ross Bridge Culvert area, in the Ross Bridge area. So the other new crew could bring the trains on in. One of the reasons it's double tracked is because of that, because they had to have a siding to pull off and change crews out. So.
All right, do we have any other questions or comments out there? Okay, well, I really want to thank all of you, Jim, Birgit, Marjorie, for contributing to this program, very interesting program, and a very interesting piece of history in our area. And Jim, again, happy birthday. Thank you for spending your birthday with us. We appreciate it.
I'm gonna go eat cake again.
Yeah, go eat your cake and ice cream now that you're done. And
Thank you.
everyone for attending our meeting, our Zoom meeting tonight. We appreciate it. We'll have another meeting the second Thursday in December. It'll be on native trees, seedlings, and why they're important in our area, and what goes into producing the seedlings that have been planted along the Greenway and in other places in our city, and just what's going on with planting these native trees, how much work it is to do that. So hope you'll join us in December.
And Michelle, we may want to mention there's an article today on al.com about the Saturday planning.
Okay, great. There's an article. We will we'll put that information out in our e-message this next Monday. We still are doing e-messages, and so we'll put that information out. So if you don't find it between now and then, you'll have it on Monday. Thanks, Henry.
It's about the vegetation clearing last year and about the seedling planting we've been doing, and some experimental things too.
And are there pictures too?
Yes.
Great, great. Thank you. And thank you, Henry, for all you've been doing, getting seedlings out there to continue our forests, our native forests, out in these areas. So we appreciate that very much.
It's a lot of volunteers.
A lot of volunteers and a lot of work on your part too. So we'll be hearing more about that in December. So again, thank you to all that are attending tonight. We appreciate it. We appreciate your attention and learning about all these interesting things about history in our area.
Birgit, can you stay for just a second for me to ask you a question?
Sure, I will.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us, Michelle.
Thank you, Birgit. We appreciate you. Thank you, Marjorie.
So Birgit, my question is, you had a term for the beveled edges of the big stones.
That's right.
Do you remember what that term is?
Yeah, hold on. I'll look it up. They're called a margin draft. That's what it's called.
Margin draft?
Yeah, and I think it's it's not a bevel. It's really, yeah, or I would call it a recess. Yeah, but yeah, maybe you can call it a bevel. I don't know. It's just a flattened area of, I don't know, 1/2 inch to 1 inch wide on the face of the stone, all around the face.
Yeah, the Birmingham Mineral Railroad ones, the box culverts, all the stones have that.
Oh, they do too? Mm-hmm.
So I've got to believe it was for a purpose for the Birmingham Mineral, for the box culverts. I think it has something to do with keeping the water turbulent as it flows through. Because with the box culverts, the stone box culverts that I'm finding, all of them have a smooth lintels on, the top part is a smooth lintel. The stones on the sides are all beveled like that on the edges, and they're chipped, they're hand chipped. And then the bottom is got humps in it. Okay, so they actually carved humps in the stones. So like fist-sized humps all up and down throughout the bottom. And I think the combination of all of that makes the water turbulent as it's going through and keeps any obstructions from building up. We're finding no leaf piles, we're finding no twigs, nothing inside these culverts. So I think the combination of all of those factors keeps the water flowing through there. But I didn't know the term for that sort of beveled edge there. But every one of them have it, every one of the stones.
Mhm.
So it's got to be, I've got to believe it's for a purpose, or why else would they do that for stones that are not going to be seen ever again, you know, except for 150 years and we're finding them again.
Right. I'm still hoping that once the city of Hoover is finding an expert to evaluate the culvert, that we will learn more about all of these features. But hopefully they can find someone who really has seen a lot of those structures before and can tell us.
It's interesting. I found an article, came across an article with a picture of a box stone culvert up in New York, railroad box culvert in New York, dating from 1840 something. And so they were, even back then, they were building them that way. So it's got to have a purpose, you know, to all of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Anyway, this is great. This is great. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Birgit. We appreciate your time and all your work you've done with this project and presenting it to us tonight. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I think it's probably, since I seem to be the person in the Birmingham Historical Society who lives in Hoover, so it's good to know about the historic heritage in Hoover, and it'll be fun to check out what the Hoover Historical Society is doing, and get with them to make sure that Rock's Gap is dealt with in a good way by the city of Hoover once they start developing that area.
It sounds like something we need to start watching closer.
Mm-hmm, I think so.
Thanks for bringing that to our attention. All right, folks, if no more comments, we're going to sign off for tonight.
Michelle?
Here. Yes, James?
You may want to do an e-message about the Shades Creek book and encourage people to think about buying it for Christmas presents. This is a good time for them to start thinking how to buy it and what the cost and all that is. Because Marjorie, I'm sure, has boxes and boxes of them still.
Okay.
This time of year when that might be good.
We'll do it. We'll do it, James.
Thanks, Michelle. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Michelle, I've got another history thing nearly ready, so I'll send it to you in the next day or two.
Well, I'm kind of getting a collection, you know, we're interspersing them with some other things. So, but go ahead and send it and we'll put it in the lineup.
Yes, I think of it. I put it down, you know, write it up. And so if you don't mind.
Sure. Go ahead.
All right. Thanks. Good
Thank
job.
you. Thanks, James. Appreciate you.
Talk to you later.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for being out here.